Good day, everybody. My name is Murray Anderson from Ashburton Investments. And on today's podcast entitled In Conversation With, I have Patrice Rassou from Ashburton Investments joining me. And Patrice is our new Chief Investment Officer, recently joining the First Rand Group as the CIO for Ashburton Investments. Interesting time for a new CIO to be joining an investment business when we've had such turmoil in the markets. So we thought it'd be a great idea to ask Patrice to come and spend some time with me in conversation. We'll talk about markets naturally, but it's also a good way for you to get to know Patrice and what he'll be doing as the new CIO of Ashburton Investments. And no doubt he's got great plans for that new role. So Patrice, good morning and welcome, and thanks for taking the time to join me in conversation today.
Good morning, Murray. It's great to be on a podcast with you. And indeed, interesting times in the market.
Absolutely. So we'll dig into that, but strange times indeed. So for somebody starting their new CIO-ship and not being able to join your team in person must be a hell of a challenge, given that we're all very sort of connected people when we're in the office talking about investment ideas and markets. So it's been 30 odd days. I guess if we count today, it's 38 days that you've officially been with your feet under the virtual desk, engaging with your new team and meeting people around the group and in the investment space. How have you found it? What's it been like?
Yes, very unusual times for humanity. I mean, we've got a third of humanity under lockdown. I joined the First Rand Group, but I wasn't able to get allocated a desk. You promised me a desk next to yours at Portside, Murray, but it has never happened. So we've become colleagues in the virtual world, and I'm participating in meetings on a digital basis, which is quite interesting. So, I mean, just to chat about that, you are very right. Nothing will ever replace face-to-face relationships. But what's interesting is I think with technology, that's bridged a lot of the distance, especially geographic distance between people. I feel I've had more meetings than ever. And I think what we've compensated for is the lack of physical interaction has been made up with more regular contacts. Yes, I agree. I think you do sacrifice the spontaneity that you get in an open plan office by having scheduled meeting. But I also think, Murray, that for millennials, this is nothing new. I mean, if I look at my kids, I mean, they communicate by WhatsApp, Instagram, they play Fortnite games with their friends. Maybe it's also a generational thing. I think we're heading into a generation where digital interaction is going to become the norm.
Absolutely. I mean, in our home as well, education's taking place over Google Classroom, varsity lectures, etc. It's been incredible. And just to talk about the technology piece, you look at the the FANGs and the amazing sort of surges they've having share prices, and companies that have come to the fore offering digital solutions. It's just been absolutely incredible to keep us connected. So I think you're right. The paradigm shift is it's going to be different forever. Going back to the office maybe once or twice a week just to connect with people and see the interaction maybe more in a collegiate and social fashion. But I mean, what I've found and speaking to most people, in the industry, financial services particularly, it seems like we've been more busy than ever. So from a productivity perspective, it's absolutely incredible. And we'll get into what it's done to the economy a little later. But I think you're quite right. You make a very valid point around. So it's been in a strange time for you to start, but hell of a interesting how we've actually seemed to be even more connected. People, are at their desks, they're working hard. Teams or Zoom or whatever technology you're using has really made one feel quite connected. So Patrice, I'm sure, it's 30 days. They say you've got to give a new executive 100 days. So what do you expect to work on and consider as you step into this role? And I'll go to your working history a little bit later, but maybe just some of the things that you're thinking about in terms of your CIO-ship and what you'd like to see and progress in the next couple of months and years, in fact.
Yeah, Murray, I think what's important in these times is to be able to put our heads together and collaborate to really deal with an issue which we haven't encountered before. what's quite interesting is quite unprecedented. I think we are used in financial history to dealing with recessions, financial crises, bankruptcies, and banking systems wobbling, but not a health crisis per se. And allied to that, we've had a quite unprecedented period where we've had a decade globally where we haven't had a recession. And now the real tipping point in markets has been something which came, from a very remote town in China, driven by wet markets. It was completely unexpected, and this is the nature of markets, to deal with the unexpected, the so-called black swan, and be able to react to it, and to be able to analyze and look forward to the impact that this will have globally and locally.
And I'm sure that's across asset classes now. So, we probably fundamentally focus on equities, which we, as I say, we'll talk about, but we've seen a remarkable recovery from the bottom of, the turning point of markets, and people have, I guess, reacted, and shares have reacted to the massive amount of quantitative easing, or rather the fiscal and the monetary policy stimulus that's going on. But maybe before we dig in markets, I'm sure there's, from a global macro asset allocation perspective, you'll be digging deeply into that with the teams and constructing our portfolios going forward as you take on the CIO ship. And I think we look forward to engaging further with you and sharing with the marketplace and what we've been doing, and maybe even some of the changes that you'll instigate into the teams.
Sure.
As we develop and hopefully improve our investment capability. Because I think we're forever learning in financial markets. I don't think anybody can ever say we're at the top of our game. It's, if you listen and read to some of the biggest and best investors in the world, everybody learns every day. So I'm sure in this new role for you as well, it's going to be a lot of that. But maybe going to learning, I'd like to just dial back for people that don't know you. And for those that are listening, Patrice and one or two of our colleagues, we actually worked together many years ago at one of our previous employers. But before you got into the world of work, Patrice, you studied to be a chartered accountant, which is a great profession. And then you moved on to study a master's in economics through the London School of Economics, and then ventured in the world of business from an MBA. So maybe just talk to us, for aspirant investors out there that might be looking to sort of emulate your career through time as they themselves develop from students to investment professionals. Maybe just take us a little bit of that journey, because it's an interesting story to understand how people get to their position now as CIO. You've had a long journey in the equity markets. Obviously, you started out somewhere as an accountant doing what, I'm not sure, but it's obviously been a wonderful 20 odd years of growth. So if you don't mind, share some thoughts around your formal in work time.
Yes, Marie. So I set out initially wanting to study to be a chartered accountant. I was lucky enough to win a scholarship to study in London. And very quickly after my first year of doing economics at the London School of Economics, I had planned to specialize in accounting, but I really didn't find that interesting. And I specialized for my degree in monetary economics. I had very interesting lecturers and professors. Professor Mervyn King, who became the governor of the Bank of England, was my lecturer. And then I continued after completing my bachelor degree to a master's in economics. Again, I was taught by very amazing lecturers. Chris Pissarides won the Nobel Prize in economics, was my lecturer. I had at some stage 3 members of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England who were either my class teachers or lecturers, because I had a specialization in monetary economics. So I completed my master's degree, also specializing in monetary economics, with a very strong bent in finance. But then that was really in the 90s when things were quite tough, and I thought to myself, what job am I going to get? And I then decided to pursue a chartered accountancy qualification also in the UK. There you don't need to have a relevant degree, which was a lot more applied. I worked basically in the city and working and auditing various financial institutions like at the time BZW, which was Barclays, UBS were clients of Mura. So I really got exposure to the world of finance and investment banking in the city of London, which really ignited my love for financial markets and this whole world for finance post the chartered accountancy qualification. I came back to complete my time at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I was in Joburg, in Sandton. And then after 2 years there, I really wanted to get into the industry, and I was lucky enough to be recruited by Dion House to the Big Green, and this is where we work together.
Okay. Yeah.
And while I was there, I decided to do an MBA, again specializing in the world of finance, because I felt that um, analyzing companies and understanding the workings of managing a company was very much the discipline that I needed. So away from the very theoretical masters in economics, I felt doing an MBA would give me more insight into how, companies are managed, organizational theory, and that really helped me early on in my career. So it's quite interesting because I do feel that having a strong academic underpin helped me at the early days in my career, but obviously this becomes the work we do is a continuous, I would say, university where you read all the time and learn all the time about business and how companies operate and evolve. So it's an ever learning job, and really I feel excited doing what we do.
Absolutely. And at a time like this, so we go into a COVID crisis, and I guess all the learnings from the practicalities of, understanding markets, doing deep dives on companies, and then all of a sudden the economic activity shut down, and now you've got companies, staring into the abyss almost. But I guess this is where the understanding of good companies and poorly structured companies comes in. So, equity analysts at this point in time are looking at their models and earnings forecasts, and you can't really. What is an earnings forecast now, given that we don't know what the economic activity is? So I guess investment analysis now is based on some really difficult decisions and looking further down the road. So maybe just some thought of that, and then I know you've over the last number of years you've been very focused on sort of concentrated equity portfolios. So maybe just in talking about that, give us a sense of what you'd be looking at in markets now, or where should people be focusing? Is it more defensive in nature? And we'll come a little bit later if you would like to talk about your area of specialization, which has been in the bank stroke financial services. So just share your views on the COVID lockdown and the economic impacts. And I think just going back to my point is saying the fundamentals of companies now are being challenged, and how does one analyze what is a good company going forward, and how do you construct a portfolio given this strange time we're in?
Yes, Murray, maybe sort of two very critical trends which one has to watch out for currently, and has been, I would say, accelerated by the COVID crisis. So in a lockdown situation, and I'm talking globally, you have the trend of social distancing, e-commerce as opposed to bricks and mortar, and the fact that convenience, I would say, has become a big driver of consumer behavior. So in that context, when you look at the world, the six largest companies in the world are, and it's my own acronym, the A4FM.
Okay.
Murray, I don't know whether you've heard of the A4FM. Is that a radio station? So
Hey, I'm wondering where we're going here.
Yeah, A4, so the four A's, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, and Alibaba. FM, Facebook, and Microsoft. These are
Okay.
the 6 biggest companies in the world. All 6 are basically internet slash technology companies. The next one, the number 7, is no other than Berkshire. So that tells you a lot of where we're going. And it's not just the older established um, technology companies. I mean, you know yourself, you mentioned earlier Zoom. The market cap of Zoom is now bigger than the world's largest, I think, largest 5 airlines. It's unbelievable. And I think this trend is not going to disappear overnight. The other big trend to watch, and it's been precipitated by the COVID crisis, is the whole matter of the oil war between Russia and the Saudis. You've had a massive demand shock, obviously, which is induced by COVID, and a supply shock. And we've seen for the first time ever the West Texas oil price go negative, minus $38 a barrel. I know it's a technicality due to the fact that oil supply in Oklahoma exceeded container or shipping capacity, but that's got deep implications for oil exporting countries. So for me, the big trends would be, let's focus on convenience, technology, e-commerce, home delivery. I think we're going to enter a decade of austerity. We've mortgaged our future by, in many economies, and South Africa is in even worse situation by building sovereign debt burdens, which means that the savings rate will have to increase. And I think industries without capital discipline will be punished. I think big oil is a prime example of an industry which has been built on big capital expenditure where the returns haven't followed. And these companies have been severely punished in our environment in Sasso.
So absolutely. And so leveraged through massive amounts of debt. Now those companies are the ones that are in extremely weak financial positions, having to restructure, and some may even go out of business. I think just in the domestic sense, the Comair story is probably, one of the darlings for many years, never passing a dividend, and now suddenly, it faces, well, it'll go through business rescue and hopefully fly again, as they say. But those are classic examples. I guess in the domestic sense, you've got the property companies in a somewhat of a similar situation. I mean, the carnage there has been absolutely incredible, and maybe the point around online shopping and home convenience means that, do we really need so many shopping centers? I think it was a lot of people wondering why we kept building these new large shopping centers and office blocks. I just look at the way we're working now and the future work, people aren't going to be going to the offices. So probably, I guess the point here is there's lots of restructuring to happen in the domestic economy to get us back to where we were pre-crisis. Might take a number of years.
Correct.
So Patrice, just to go back to your previous role before you joined us was of head of equities at a particular large financial services business, and no doubt you had a large team of analysts and were scouring the markets for opportunities. But maybe if I had to ask, if you had a hypothetical new investor coming in today, giving you a starting capital of 100 million rand for a domestic equity portfolio, which needs to be fully invested, just give us a broad sense of what you'd be looking at, given what we've just spoken about in terms of an allocation across the equity sectors. Where would you be putting your money? And this is hypothetical, of course.
Yeah, it's a good question, Murray. I mean, I always say, and it's an old adage, the first rule of investment is not to lose money. And the second rule, as you know, Murray, is refer to rule number 1. So
Yeah.
if that's our starting objective, I would now focus on companies with very strong balance sheets, which will survive this crisis. I think it's very important that our teams have a philosophy where we focus on quality when we pick companies. Quality meaning companies with high returns, good good capital allocation, which dominate their sectors. And I would really, in terms of investment strategy, focus like this. Because I think we are in an era where a few things are going to be combined. We're going to have a situation where, as already mentioned, I think consumer behavior will change. It will take a long time to get back to normality. Uh, I think the current situation might be followed by a bit of a debt crisis also, in the sense of I think capital would be difficult to come by. And for me, I like a portfolio really model like our Global Leaders Fund, where you have stocks which dominate globally, not necessarily locally. And these are companies which have been able to grab market share from smaller rivals. And I think this trend of larger global caps grabbing more market share and becoming more dominant will continue. I mean, in our own market, the like of Naspers with Tencent, which is a dominant internet player in China, I think that trend will continue. In a global context, as I mentioned already, the FANGs, I think their dominance of the market will continue. So this focused portfolio should be focused on those winners who are able to thrive in the current environment. And I would continue focusing on global players rather than purely domestic small and mid caps in a very concentrated portfolio.
I read a very interesting article just the other day talking about, can small or mid grow? And what's interesting is the article was describing the fact that actually large corporates have been able to spend significant amounts of money on R&D, which actually turns them into innovators and has continued the acceleration. So often the concept of big is boring and big will fall and small will overtake is actually that, these companies have invested a substantial amount of money through the profits that they generate back into R&D and actually have been able to innovate. And I look broadly in the South African context, we're seeing large corporates able to do that as well, which just keeps their dominant position in play. So I think, naturally that's something we'll look at. I wanted to maybe just narrow the aperture somewhat onto, the banks and the financial sector in South Africa. Any thoughts there for the listener in terms of what you're seeing and reading? I know you've been staying close to the companies that you've looked at in the past, and obviously being part of a large financial services business yourself, there's always an interest in what's going on in that market. Any thoughts and views?
Yeah, sure, Murray. What's interesting is banks locally and actually in Europe have been harder hit than during the global financial crisis, which is quite extraordinary because I mean we had in the 10 years ago in the global financial crisis, it was really sort of a mortgage lending crisis which morphed into a liquidity crunch. Um, and we've had a very tough period for the financials because low interest rates, especially for banks, are not good for bank margins. So going in the current crisis, it's interesting that the sell-off, definitely in Europe and in South Africa, have driven the banks' valuations even lower than what they were at during the financial crisis. The difference is, I think, their capital positions are a lot stronger, so they're going into this crisis into much stronger capital positions. But on the other hand, we are likely to see bad debt levels going from record low to higher levels, and dividends are likely to be cut for at least 1 or 2 years. So I think for the patient investor on a 5-year view, I think they look extremely attractive. On the insurance side, which I would say insurers are likely to be more defensive, they have more diverse operations, especially the local ones, into the rest of Africa. Lapses are likely to spike. The market correction is likely to hurt the investment portfolio, and the bottom end of the market, which they're very exposed to, are likely to be hit by retrenchments, and insurers with corporate businesses, which is quite low margin businesses, will also be hurt by the fact that there's likely to be retrenchment and companies going under. So I would say you need to take a longer term view, but valuations are very attractive, more attractive than they were at the bottom in 2009.
So I think you talk about valuations, and broadly from an allocation for investors, there's certainly a long trend of going offshore and looking for opportunities. But I think the point you're making here is that there's some really compelling opportunities. I think one has to be quite selective, and you use the word quality wisely there. And I think, from an investor perspective, the allocation of do I go offshore now, given where the rand is, versus the opportunities at home, there's certainly got to be some long-term buys that have popped up in this last market, even though we've had somewhat of a little bit of a rally up from the bottom of where we were in March. So, certainly I guess the Ashburton view as well is, look closely at home before you rush offshore. But just going to the global leaders portfolio, which you mentioned, is large cap offshore. But one of the holdings in that portfolio is, you mentioned earlier, Berkshire Hathaway. And just last week, I think it was, or maybe just over a week ago, they had the Berkshire Hathaway AGM, and Warren Buffett was up on stage, apparently using a PowerPoint presentation for the first time in his life, because he couldn't have the audience in front of him. Were you ever a disciple of the Buffett value approach? Is he someone that you look to and sort of acknowledge his style as one that you would follow, or is your own particular investment style rather one of growth? Maybe share some thoughts there.
Sure, Murray. Very early in my career, I was influenced by the work of Graham and Dodd, the book called The Intelligent Investor.
Sure.
And as you would know, Warren Buffett learned from Benjamin Graham. He was taught at university in Columbia by Benjamin Graham. So the whole idea of value investing is one which really influenced my thinking early on in my career. I was also privileged enough, the one and only Berkshire AGM I attended was in 2009, shortly after the financial crisis. And the nice thing with this AGM is that if you come from overseas, you get to meet Warren Buffett himself. There's a long queue. You get to speak to him for 10 seconds, but you get to meet him. And he autographed one of the books that I brought with. So that was quite a privilege. And as you mentioned, yes, I do follow his letters very closely. I've read each one of those. And at the current AGM, as you mentioned, it was quite interesting. Yes, he had a very plain, as you would say, PowerPoint presentation in black and white with no fancy slideshows.
But I think that wasn't even 101 that he got the crash course the night before.
Yes, but what's quite interesting, he went through, and that's what I like about him. He went through financial history, and he made the one point which stayed with me, which actually got me thinking. He made the following point at the AGM, that the United States of America is just over 200 years old, which doesn't sound very long. And he said his combined age, him and Charlie Munger, is just over 180 years old, just to show that actually he's got a depth of, between the two of them, the wise men, between the two of them, they've got a depth of experience, but actually, in his view, financial history is not that long. And what was fascinating was for him to say, going back through various crises, even the Spanish flu and the Great Depression, he couldn't find anything equivalent to the COVID crisis. And the other point he also made was that, and I think you touched on it already, he didn't behave like he did during the global financial crisis, where he put a lot of his cash pile at work and rescued really a number of companies. During the global financial crisis, Buffett became the lender of last resort and invested in a number of companies, very, very shrewd. This time around, as you mentioned, the only thing he really did was to buy back some of his own shares, and he's been sitting on the sideline, and maybe surprisingly enough, he sold all his airline shares, which is very unusual behavior.
Absolutely. And with $137 billion in cash, saying there's nothing I can find to buy is quite astounding. So
yes.
Just an incredible investment journey that. So, yeah, I mean, I think just listening to him, the financial history story was amazing. And the power of the American market, and I guess it's the American consumer. I mean, I do wonder, there are lots of different views around where the future growth comes from. And I think, having exposure to emerging markets or global emerging markets at some point when, the consumption rates in India and China match the same levels of what's been going on in the US, we might find the global allocation moving from the dollar as being the main currency that the world uses. But those are long trends that we'll no doubt be talking about in the future. But very an interesting point in time with American politics as well. So some very interesting months and years ahead of us. Patrice, we're slowly coming to the end of our time, and I thank you for sharing those thoughts. So we mentioned, some books. You mentioned Intelligent Investor. Are there any other suggestions out there for the listener that you have found important, sort of cornerstones of your process and thinking that people can maybe reach out and have a look at? Maybe one or two, if there's anything you'd like to share.
Yeah, I'd mentioned two books. For me, early on, in terms of learning the mechanics of financial markets, I found that George Soros really was one of the great hedge fund investors. He's also an LSE graduate. His book on the workings of financial markets and theory of reflexivity for me was one of the best in terms of describing how markets work. And then, as I mentioned, having been taught at the LSE by the former governor of the Bank of England, Professor Mervyn King, he's recently written a book with John Kay called Radical Uncertainty, which is basically making decisions beyond the numbers. And I think in the current times, this book is very appropriate because it warns about the use of models based on probabilities in an era where I guess black swans are more common than one would expect, and it's always very dangerous to base big decisions by looking at the past or looking at a very narrow probabilistic lens. So I think that's also a book I would recommend, Radical Uncertainty by Marvin King and
Great.
John Kay.
Super, Patrice, it's very kind of you. I remember trying to read a George Soros book about 15 years ago. So I've got it on my shelf. I think it's called, I can't even remember what it's called. It was so scary. But thanks for that. We'll definitely go and reach into the cupboard and give it another bash. But Patrice, thank you very much for sharing your time with us this morning. It's been a great chat, and hopefully for the listeners to get to know you a little bit better as you start out in your new role. We certainly wish you the best of luck, and we'll definitely have you on another podcast in a couple of months' time as we catch up and work on how these markets have evolved from this point in time. Thanks very much, Patrice, and have a good day. And to everybody that listened, we appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.